Waking up, the human soldier found his unexpected reward. A beautiful alien slave, the soldier woke up with a sharp pain in his head. The world around him was dark, cold, and unfamiliar. He slowly opened his eyes, but the light that filtered through the strange windows made his head throb even more. Blinking, he tried to push through the dizziness. Where was he? The last thing he remembered was the battle. Everything before that seemed to blur into an endless swirl of chaos. His body felt stiff, sore from the rough handling, and his hands were bound. Panic crept into his chest as he realized he wasn't in his ship. He wasn't anywhere familiar. His military instincts kicked in. He immediately tried to assess his surroundings, looking for any kind of escape. The room was sparse, the walls made of smooth, shiny surfaces that seemed to pulse faintly with a strange energy. The air smelled different, stale and metallic, with no hint of the familiar scents of the earth he knew. He pulled at the restraints on his arms, trying to break free, but they held firm. His mind raced. The last mission had gone horribly wrong. They'd been ambushed, and his squad had been wiped out in minutes. He remembered the blinding flash of energy weapons, the sound of his comrades' screams, and then darkness. He had been captured. But who were they? What was happening now? A soft, almost musical sound broke the silence, and he stiffened. Was it a trap? He turned his head toward the sound, but he couldn't see who was approaching. The door to his cell opened slowly, and he was momentarily blinded by the light that poured in. A figure entered, silhouetted against the light. At first he thought it might be one of his captors, but as the figure stepped into the dimmer light of the room, he saw her clearly. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen, tall with an elegance that seemed out of place in the cold, sterile room. She moved with a grace that was almost otherworldly. Her skin shimmered faintly, a soft pale color that reflected the light in delicate ways, but it was her eyes that caught his attention. They were dark, deep pools that seemed to hold a whole universe of emotion. Her gaze was intense, and yet there was something gentle about it. Her hair was long, dark, and straight, flowing down her back like a river of midnight. She wore simple clothing, but it suited her, highlighting her delicate features. Everything about her spoke of a strange beauty, a beauty that felt both familiar and foreign. The soldier blinked, his mind trying to piece together what he was seeing. She wasn't one of the enemy's soldiers, that much was clear. But who was she, and what was she doing here? The woman spoke, her voice soft, yet clear. The words were strange, foreign, nothing he recognized. His confusion only deepened as she continued to speak. He couldn't understand her language, but the tone was soothing. It wasn't a language of command or threat, but something else entirely. There was kindness in her voice. She approached him slowly, as if she were used to being cautious with others. Sat down beside him, her eyes never leaving his face, and for a brief moment, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. Despite the strange surroundings, despite the pain in his head and the confusion, he felt no immediate fear. It was as though this woman's presence made everything feel less hostile. He couldn't understand her words, but she gently touched his arm, inspecting his restraints. With a few quiet movements, she began to work at them, her fingers quick and deft, as if she had done this many times before. He watched her, unsure of what to do. But he wanted to speak, to ask her questions, but the language barrier was an immediate wall between them. Still, there was something in her touch, something in her expression that told him she wasn't his enemy. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the restraints loosened. She stood up and backed away, giving him space. He tested his wrists, stretching them out, grateful for the freedom. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. He was still trapped on this strange planet, wherever it was. Still, the woman's presence gave him some hope. She smiled at him, a small, gentle smile that made her eyes soften. It was the first real sign of warmth he had seen since waking up. He couldn't help but feel a small wave of gratitude. She hadn't spoken a word he understood, But in that moment, it didn't matter. There was a kindness in her, something he hadn't expected in a place like this. She turned and began to walk toward the door. The soldier wanted to ask her where she was going, but his throat was dry, and the words didn't come out. Instead, he watched as she disappeared through the door, leaving him alone once more in the silence of the room. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. He couldn't help but think about her, about the way she had moved, the way she had looked at him. Who was she? Why had she helped him? Was she a prisoner like him? Or was she something else entirely? Finally, the door opened again, and this time, she entered with a small tray of food. She set it down before him with a quiet grace, and again, she spoke in the strange language. He stared at her, unsure how to respond, but she didn't seem to mind. She simply gestured to the food and stepped back, giving him space. The soldier's stomach growled in response. The food was simple, some kind of fruit, a soft bread, and water. But it was enough. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until now. He reached for the bread and took a bite, the texture unfamiliar but not unpleasant. The woman watched him as he ate, her gaze calm and patient. It was clear she wasn't expecting anything from him in return, but the soldier couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. She had saved him from his restraints and had given him something to eat when he hadn't even known how long it had been since his last meal. As he finished, he set the food down and looked up at her, wondering what would happen next. She didn't speak, but she smiled again, and for the first time since waking up, he felt a glimmer of hope. There was something about her that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely alone in this strange place. The soldier knew that this wasn't the end of his story, that he still had to find a way to escape, to get back to his people. But in this moment, with the soft warmth of the food in his belly and the silent understanding between him and this alien woman, he allowed himself to rest. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to find out. The soldier sat in the quiet room, still trying to process everything that had happened. He had no idea where he was or why he was here. The mysterious woman had given him food, and in some strange way, she had offered him a sense of peace in a place that was anything but peaceful. He didn't know what her intentions were, but there was something about her that made him feel like he could trust her. In the days that followed, they formed a strange routine. She would bring him food, always in silence, and always with that calm, patient smile. He tried speaking to her, but the language barrier was too much. The words he spoke were foreign to her, and hers were just as strange to him. But despite not being able to communicate, there was an understanding between them, a connection that neither could explain. But it was there, in the way she looked at him, in the way she helped him without question. The soldier began to pay closer attention to his surroundings, looking for any sign of a way out. His instincts told him that escaping was possible, but he couldn't do it alone. And he wasn't sure he could trust the woman, even though her actions seemed to suggest she wasn't his enemy. Still, he was stuck, bound in a strange place with no one to help him except for her. One evening, as she brought him his meal, the soldier decided to try something different. He had been practicing a few hand gestures, hoping to find a way to communicate without words. He pointed to himself and then mimicked the action of walking, then pointed to her. She seemed to understand. "Escape?" he asked quietly, using the only word he could think of. Her face softened, and she shook her head slightly. He couldn't be sure what that meant, but it didn't seem like good news. She then motioned toward the door, and the soldier followed her gaze. Outside, there were guards. They had been posted at regular intervals since his arrival. He knew that any escape attempt would have to be carefully planned. He didn't give up, though. Each day, he observed more and more. He watched how the guards moved, how they interacted with the people in the compound. He noticed that the woman was treated with respect, but also with a certain distance. She was clearly not in charge here. But the way the guards looked at her sometimes, there was something there, something more than mere respect. The soldier began to wonder if she was more than just a servant or a prisoner like him. Was she somehow part of the reason he had been brought here? He didn't know, but he began to realize that escaping on his own might not be the best option. He would need her help if he was to make it out. One night, when the guard seemed to be more distracted than usual, the soldier decided it was time to ask her directly. He didn't have much to lose. She had been kind to him, and he had no idea if he would ever get another chance. He waited until she brought his evening meal, and as she set the food down, he made a simple gesture with his hand. He pointed to the door and mimicked the action of running, looking at her for a response. She paused for a moment, her eyes flickering to the door and then back to him. Her expression was unreadable. Finally, she nodded, ever so slightly. It was the smallest of gestures, but it filled the soldier with a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape together. Over the next few days, they started to communicate more. It wasn't easy, but they managed to build a system of gestures and expressions that allowed them to exchange basic ideas. The soldier showed her how he had been marking the shifts of the guards, and she seemed to understand. They began to plan, though carefully, and with great caution. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They were both still prisoners in this strange, hostile place. But despite their plans, the soldier couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't fully trust her. It wasn't that he thought she had any bad intentions. He didn't. But there were too many unanswered questions. Why was she here? How had she ended up in this place? And why was she helping him, a stranger, with so much care and attention? It wasn't normal, at least not in his experience. There was always an agenda when it came to survival. One evening, after their usual silent exchange, the soldier tried again. This time, he wasn't looking for a gesture. He needed answers. He needed to know if she was truly on his side. He reached for her arm gently, his touch tentative. She didn't flinch. He spoke slowly, his voice rough, but he needed to be understood. "Why help me?" he asked, his words simple but sincere. She looked at him, her expression soft but distant. For a long time, she didn't say anything. He waited, watching her, hoping for an answer. Finally, she spoke in the soft, melodic language he had heard before. It was like music to his ears, though he couldn't understand it. But this time, she pointed to herself and then to him. Then she mimicked the motion of sharing, as if offering him something. The soldier stared at her, trying to make sense of her words and gestures. Slowly, a realization began to settle in. She wasn't just helping him because she felt obligated to. There was something more. She saw something in him, something that made her want to help. Perhaps it was her own desire for freedom, or maybe it was something else entirely. He let go of her arm, suddenly feeling embarrassed. He didn't know what to say. All his life he had been taught to be self-reliant, to trust only in himself. But now, in this strange place, with this stranger who had shown him kindness, he was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, relying on others wasn't so bad after all. The woman turned to leave, but before she did, she paused at the door. She looked back at him, her gaze lingering for a moment. Then, with a small nod, she stepped out, leaving him to think about everything that had just happened. The soldier sat back against the wall, trying to process the new information. He had no idea what her true motives were, but he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of trust in her. In a place like this, trust was a dangerous thing, but it was also something that could lead to survival. He wasn't sure what the future held. The odds were stacked against him, and the road ahead would be long and treacherous. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time since waking up on this alien planet, he felt like there might be a way out. The days turned into weeks, and the soldier grew more familiar with the strange world he was trapped in. Though the woman never spoke much, their bond had grown stronger. Every day they silently exchanged glances, small gestures, and shared moments of trust. He began to feel less like a prisoner and more like someone who had a purpose again. even though that purpose still seemed unclear. He had spent much of his time observing the patterns of the guards, studying the layout of the compound, and silently preparing for the moment when they would escape. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, seemed to understand the urgency in his actions. She continued to assist him in small ways, bringing him food, helping him with his wounds, and providing what little comfort she could. There was no verbal agreement between them, no explicit plan discussed, but the unspoken bond between them was undeniable. Each night when the guards seemed to relax, she would visit him, always keeping her movements as quiet as possible. She was cautious, but there was a sense of hope in her eyes that the soldier had not seen in anyone else. It made him believe, more and more, that there was a chance for both of them to escape. One evening, when the compound seemed quieter than usual, the soldier made his decision. The time had come. They couldn't wait forever, and every moment they stayed here put them in greater danger. He caught the woman's eye as she brought him his meal, her face as calm as ever, but her eyes betrayed the same understanding. She knew what was coming. He gestured to her, indicating the door, then pointed to himself, then to her, and mimicked the act of running, his eyes locked with hers, waiting for her response. She looked at him for a long moment, as if considering the weight of the decision. Then, with the slightest of nods, she confirmed it. The time had come. They would run. The soldier's heart raced with anticipation. His mind raced with plans, ideas, and the fleeting fear that it might fail, but he couldn't afford to hesitate anymore. Together, they would escape, or they wouldn't. They spent the next few hours moving in complete silence, checking their surroundings constantly. The guards were shifting, and the soldier knew that now was the perfect time. They silently made their way to the back of the compound, avoiding the main hallways and staying out of sight. The woman led the way, her steps light and quick. Though she moved with purpose, Jay had been here longer than him, and he followed her without question. They reached a narrow hallway at the back of the compound that led to an exit, an escape route the soldier had been watching for days. It was not easy to get to, but it was their best chance. They moved carefully, avoiding the guards as they slipped past unnoticed, hearts pounding. The soldier could hear the faint echoes of footsteps, but they didn't stop. Each step felt like a victory, and though the compound seemed quiet, he knew the real danger was still out there. When they reached the door, the soldier's hands trembled. This was the moment they had both been waiting for. He reached for the door, his mind buzzing with questions. Would they be caught? Was this truly their escape, or would they find themselves back in chains? But there was no turning back. He opened the door and they slipped outside, into the cold night air. The night sky above them was different from anything the soldier had ever seen. The stars were bright and unfamiliar, the landscape stretching out before them like a new world. It was both beautiful and terrifying. They had escaped the compound, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The soldier and the woman continued to move quickly, heading into the dense forest that surrounded the compound. The air was thick with the scent of alien plants and the sounds of creatures, some familiar, some entirely foreign, echoed through the trees. The woman seemed to know where she was going, guiding them through the wilderness with quiet confidence. As they moved deeper into the forest, the soldier began to feel a sense of relief. For the first time since he had woken up in this strange place, he felt free. But he also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. They had escaped the compound, but there was still so much they didn't know. They didn't know where they were, or if anyone was out there to help them. They didn't know what would happen next. The woman stopped abruptly, and the soldier nearly bumped into her. She turned to face him, her eyes serious. She gestured to a small, hidden clearing up ahead, then pointed to herself and mimicked the action of resting. It was clear she needed a break, and the soldier nodded. They would rest for a while. They couldn't keep running forever. They sat in the clearing, both of them exhausted, but feeling a sense of accomplishment. The soldier leaned back against a large rock, watching as the woman took a deep breath and closed her eyes. There was a certain peace to the moment, a fleeting sense of calm before the storm. But they both knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The soldier looked at the woman, his mind filled with questions. Who was she, really? What had brought her here? Why had she helped him escape? But he didn't ask. There was no need. They didn't have the words to explain everything. But the bond between them spoke louder than anything they could say. As they sat there in silence, the soldier realized that the true reward wasn't escaping from the compound, nor was it freedom. The real reward was finding someone who cared, someone who would risk everything for him without expecting anything in return. He had spent his life fighting alone, trusting only in his own abilities. But in that moment, he realized that perhaps the greatest strength came from relying on others. The woman opened her eyes and they shared a brief glance. She stood up, stretching her arms and looking toward the distant horizon. The soldier followed her gaze, seeing nothing but the unknown. But for the first time since waking up on this alien world, he felt a sense of hope. They were free, and together, they would face whatever came next. With a final nod, the woman began to walk, and the soldier followed. There was still so much to discover, so much to face. But he wasn't alone anymore. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, side by side.